Good afternoon. The post-lunch slot, so hopefully I will keep you with me. So my name's Paul. I look after the procurement teams at Heathrow. And when the team invited us to come along and speak, I thought, do we go and talk about something that we're doing? What's the best way to pitch it? And I thought I'd share some of the challenges that we're facing into as procurement at the moment, and really to give an insight for those who are looking to work with Heathrow in terms of some of the things we're wrestling with. So hopefully when you come to look to get work with us, it'll help. So it's interesting, when I go to some of the local schools and I ask the question of the students there, what do you think procurement is? Other than a lot of very confused looks, immediate glazing over. Eventually, after the tumbleweed stops, one bright young soul eventually puts their hands up, and with hope and optimism I say, yes. And they say, how much do you earn and what car do you drive? So it's a difficult sell to the youth, but previously it's been quite easy to then give a description and a definition of what procurement is. But there's been a lot of disrupting factors, particularly over the last few years, that have made it a much more complex answer to give. So I've been asking, what's our identity, what's our responsibility as procurement, and how do I, in my role, make sure that my teams are doing the right things? So with that challenge, like any professional, I found some time and space on my own, gathered my thoughts, and asked Google. And Google came up with a number of answers. But as you can see, a lot of them are still, or were still, focused on cost, money, negotiating, free suppliers for every bid. And I kind of challenged the fact that that's still the norm within procurement. And then we looked a little bit deeper, and there was some more edifying statements in there around quality, around sustainability being driven by procurement functions, and around value and finding the right capability. When I was younger and first came into a procurement function, one of the key challenges was cost, time, quality. It was a nice traditional model. But even those facets have changed in terms of how we as procurement come out and look. So when we look at cost, for example, we buy to a price point, but there's so much information in the market now that unless it's first of type or incredibly complex, there's a deviation within price. So within that whole procurement piece around lowest cost or most economically advantageous tender, it's just blown out a little bit to be cost is just a player within a wider value stream. Time is a really interesting one that we're challenging ourselves with. How many bids, how many opportunities do you get where it's a really nice, complicated piece of scope with a date on that's completely unattainable that the client wants to be delivered? Regular and often. And usually the first conversations when you appoint your supplier is a good conversation about how long it will actually take for them to go ahead and deliver the work. And that, for me, is one of those responsibilities as a client to put the constraints together and ask the question of a supply chain as to when they believe it can be delivered. Quality is the one that kind of emerged through the kind of 60s and 70s and then grew. But nowadays, a lot of our suppliers have very similar accreditations, have very similar quality stamps within their work. So people will argue, well, you buy the people most capable to do the work, which is a really interesting thing, because even if you run a really successful procurement exercise, you can still end up coming a cropper once you get into work. One that's really important to us at Heathrow, and one that kind of came into that trifecta early in the kind of 70s and 80s, started off as the safety police, and everyone was bothered about the safety police, but then people started understanding the real impact that safety had in the workplace. Not only the emotional impact of having a safety incident, which very sadly at Heathrow we had a fatality recently, and the impact to your teams and to the organisation can't be underestimated from an emotional perspective. But if you look at it from a business perspective, there is no greater disruptor to cost and time in your procurement than poor safety or poor delivery of safety. So that always remains fundamental. And the 80s and 90s, there was lots of sustainability, lots of people talking about sustainability, lots of people talking about carbon and net zero and social value, but only really recently has it found its way into that model as a real differentiator between suppliers and something that clients are seeking more and more. And then, I don't know when it was, but we all got an email from our IT teams, our technology partners, And they said, do you know that everything you look at and everything you do is available to everyone outside of the business? And are you protecting yourself from a cyber perspective? And cyber and security for us at Heathrow, and I'm sure for many of you, has come in as such a major player in what we do. In order to work with Heathrow, there is a whole bunch of cyber checks and cyber policies that must be adhered to. So that kind of blows the cost, time, quality model out a little bit more. But I'd still argue that those things in relation to each other are important differentiators. But actually one of the really, really key differentiators is finding a supplier that you can work with, is finding a trusted partner that you can solve problems with. One of the things that we often say is that someone may have a really good silo bid, someone may have a really good cost bid, a really good time bid. But actually, if they're not willing to collaborate and work with you on other areas, if they're closed off to sustainability, if they're closed off to developing their product, then you're not going to go much further than the bid that you got. So we've had to really start thinking it through. And in particular, in recent times at Heathrow, we've been really, really looking at and challenging ourselves as to whether or not that traditional model really drives the decisions that we need anymore. Do those individual aspects differentiate suppliers, or do we as a client have a responsibility in procurement to do something a little bit differently? And our argument at the moment and the conversations that we're having internally at the moment is that we do. And there's actually a different way to approach procurement and look at things. Like I said, even the best run competition can end up with you a year later standing in a room looking at your peers going, why won't they just leave? Why are they still here? And clients, it's really important that not only to attract talent and people to your business that you have an ESG agenda, but actually the companies working for us need to be able to show that they have an ESG agenda and a platform within the client to bring it to the fore and to bring their best to bear. And that's one of the things we ask for our partners. We're not interested in all the things that we ask you to do. What's the thing that you're centrally invested in as a company? What's the thing that's important to you? Tell us about that, and let's celebrate and let's bring that to the fore. Equally, and especially as a hub airport in the UK and competing with other hub airports around the world, many of you will have seen that our license to grow, our license to expand the airport is heavily beaten down in sustainability. We must reach our sustainability goals, and Heathrow has taken out a sustainability bond, which says that not only do we mean it, but actually we've geared our finances against hitting our sustainability targets. And if we don't, there's quite severe consequences for Heathrow. So that shows the commitment that we're going forward with as a client. So how do we differentiate today? And this is the piece that as a procurement function we've been arguing and talking about. Is it the best of certain attributes that works? Is it a shift based on the complexity of the service? Is it a little bit of everything and actually leave the market to decide and guide you? What we're looking at is actually we need to set a bar. So we need to create an environment where you have the credentials to go through and get given opportunities at Heathrow. And that comes down to our responsibility as a client to make sure that we're working with good, responsible companies. Now that bar isn't particular sets and metrics that should be abhorrent or difficult for a supply chain to reach. They're mainly geared around that piece of collaboration. They're mainly geared around the commitments and the openness to work with us to further progress. We as a client aren't at the end success celebrating that we're there on sustainability, but we know we've got a story to write, and we want to work with supply chain who equally feel they have a story to write. So across those key aspects of cyber and technology, ESG and our sustainability agenda, health, safety and well-being, and chasing a safety culture as opposed to just safety statistics, and some of those things that kind of make Heathrow special around collaboration and working together and joining together as companies. We also argue that some of those aren't competitive forces. Therefore, having them as a bar doesn't differentiate. You should have a health, safety and well-being culture within your business. And therefore, we just want to understand that and make sure that it matches up to our own values. And actually, a big flag is a company who's not willing to be open and share with you on health and safety. Responsible sourcing underpins pretty much everything we do now. We have a Heathrow Balanced Scorecard, which looks at all of our net zero, all of our social value, and all of our local economy policies and procedures. And not only do we hold ourselves to the Balanced Scorecard, but all of our top tier 1 companies are signed up to that scorecard as well. They have a baseline, and we're looking for them to grow from that baseline and demonstrate that with their supply chains, they're exhibiting the same practices. Cyber and security is turning into one of those must-haves. It's turning into one of those areas where it's essential. And lots of people, I'm sure, on this stage will have talked about supply chain resilience. Cyber is really one of those areas that trips into that space. And it isn't the big partners, it isn't the big spend that drives that resilience. It can be the small partner at a point of vulnerability that really drives your risk in that space. And we want our partners to be opportunities, not threats. But I bring it back to what's really, really key for us is a partner who is willing to collaborate and willing to go on that journey together. If you get a partner who's just focused on cost, time and quality, then for certain small works that might be okay. If they've got a bit of an umbrella around some of the other aspects, that's great, but the winner that comes out is always those who collaborate. And actually sometimes it's better to purchase or procure a down selection for a partner that you know will work with you as opposed to someone who's got the proprietary system of choice. So we've looked to create qualifying value criteria. This is something that we're working on at Heathrow at the moment. And this is something as well that we're doing in consultation and collaboration, not only with our tier 1 suppliers, but also across our SME community to make sure that it's achievable, it's attainable, and it's something that the right companies can engage in and do. From a collaboration perspective, we want to make sure that we're spending the right amount of time with the people who drive the real value in our work. And as a result of this, alongside our sustainability, we've reinvented all of our supplier relationship management protocols, and we've reinvented how we work and operate with that supply chain, both in terms of roles and responsibilities. So how are we doing? We are equally on a journey, the same as everyone else. Our balanced scorecard approach has gone down quite well. There's a lot of learning that comes from that. And one of the things that I really like about it is you're not going to get an extra % for going through the balanced scorecard in your margin. You're not going to get an extra bit of profit. What we do is we work with those companies to celebrate them. And when I say that, it's not just a nice hippie thing that we all get round and celebrate. We will walk them into other clients. We will walk them across to the connections that we have within the transport sector, within the aviation sector, and we'll say, look at what this supplier's done for us. If you were to visit our head offices in Compass Centre, it's full of vinyls at the moment celebrating some of the great news stories that have come out of Balanced Scorecard. None of our supply chain asked us to do that. We did that on our own back to celebrate them, and it does go quite a long way. Cyber is one of those things that's constantly emerging, but we've looked at third-party usage policies, and again, we're bringing in the experts to help us in that space, but not only help us, we pay for them to contract with the companies that we operate with so that they can go and support those companies. There's a shared passion on safety at Heathrow. It's absolutely in our DNA to be safe. We would celebrate someone stopping work for safety reasons as much as getting it done on time. And that's something that we will always do. I think it's safe to say that areas like preventative health and well-being are emerging, and they're things that are growing. And again, those are things that we're looking to start assessing and making sure that we're giving good access across the market to the experts and the subject matter experts who are really leading in those fields. So what are we saying? What's the summary? I think it's important to understand the definition of value that we have for services and for works, and it's important that those who work with us understand that definition. We are not a free bids needed for every tender company. We are not a lowest price company. We will work with the right partners that emerge from whatever process it is that we are running. The mix of those drivers and those areas that we had have changed. And our previously held beliefs around those have changed. But changing a culture isn't easy. There will still be people, and there still are people within our business and stakeholders external to our business who look over us, who will talk about Why have you gone for that and not the lowest cost? So it is a battle and a mission to keep us going on that edge. It's also a battle and a mission to keep the value definition rather than the savings definition within procurement. We don't have a savings register, we have a value register. That records everything from social value, from net zero reductions to cost savings and time savings. I feel, and I know a lot of the people in the room will feel, that we have a responsibility to lead. We have a responsibility to do these things. I had a great session last week with Lower Thames Crossing. I don't know if any of you work with Lower Thames Crossing, but that team is doing some really, really special things around net zero and some really, really strong commitments for a company that is basically going to lay a lot of concrete. So it's a really brave thing to make commitments on carbon. But some of the work they're doing, if you get a chance to go and see, is groundbreaking for our industry. Not only that, we've seen the first net zero construction site in Oslo. So there's lots and lots of opportunities for us to get out and to learn. And as clients, it's very important that we don't think we have all the answers, but it's also really important that we're active and we get out there and we learn and we listen. And the final thing I would say is that the shift isn't over. These things are constantly evolving. Our supply chain was delighted once they'd baselined against our balanced scorecard for us to turn around and go, you've all done really, really well. So we're going to change all the measures and make it so much harder. And they all after they got over the initial frustration of their gold rating turning into entry level, they all got it. They all got it. There's no point in having something that goes to 2030 that you're already achieving on. Stretch the ambition, stretch the target. So I hope it's useful. Like I said, I wanted to share a little bit the challenges and some of the thoughts and things that we're thinking about, some of the things that we're observing at the moment in the procurement space. And I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of disruptors. And if you want to achieve growth, as we absolutely do for the UK, and to connect the UK to the world, we have to make sure that we do it responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any questions from the audience, by the way? If you have a question, put your hand up and we can bring a microphone out to you. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask one of these first. If you can keep your hand up, please. If we can take the microphone out, please. I'm going to ask one of the questions that came in here via the app, so thank you for sending these in virtually. You've probably touched on this answer already, Paul, to be honest, but what positive outcomes have been observed as a result of these efforts to strengthen the identification of procurement at Heathrow?
So one of the kind of key things that I'm most passionate about is the sustainability part of it. And it's interesting that balanced scorecard and the piece that we do, a lot of people are saying, well, some of the stuff in the baseline is stuff that your suppliers are already doing. And we've got to find a way of connecting our colleagues within our businesses to what's going on, and procurement can do that. By creating that, so for example, a lot of our supply chain would talk about the reductions that they've made in carbon over a period of time. That would go into our carbon team, it would go into our ESG report, off it goes. Now through the balanced scorecard, that goes into everyone who connects with that account. It leads to questions, it leads to education, it leads to people trying to understand what they can do more for. We had an SME who worked for us, who works for us at the moment, called MJM. And one of the things that they stood up and said at one of our forums was, your safety culture, your quality culture is really demanding. But actually what it means is we walk through the doors of other clients and we are so far ahead of some of the competition that we're winning lots and lots of work. And they diversified their portfolio hugely during the pandemic outside of the airport on that basis. And until they'd taken the step outside to go and look, they hadn't realised it. So it's that piece of how can we, by setting a bar, help our suppliers to raise their bar and equally make them more competitive, because it's got to be two-way.
Okay, thank you. And if we can have your question, please state your name and where you're from, please. Oh. Sorry, I thought we'd got there already. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned value register, replacing your savings register. I really like that idea. I'm trying to do a similar thing. How are you putting a value against some of them social initiatives you run, or sustainability or anything like that? How are you? It's always been hard enough to put a value against some of the make savings black and white. So how are you doing a number against that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so there's a number of things that we do. So social value, for example, we'll do volunteering hours. We will put things in there around diversity mix and diversity achievement. We're also looking at the moment, measures on accessibility. So how accessible was a facility before versus after works, and therefore making sure that the people within our teams who are going out to buy that work know that they've got a value to create through doing it. So it's not just the measures, it's actually what the measures drive in terms of behaviours. Carbon is interesting. So carbon, we're putting a carbon pound. So we're valuing carbon and putting carbon pounds in, which again, I'm sure a lot of people are doing, but we're still talking about kind of tonnage and reduction in tonnage. And also we touch on cost, we touch on time, we touch on those things that you would expect a procurement space to touch on. I think one of the key things is you don't get to the end of a job and talk about on time, on budget. You get to the end of the job and there's a real thing, not just for us as a company to promote, celebrate, become brandable as a result, but actually for the teams involved in the project, they've taken part in something far bigger than just a piece of work.
Okay, thank you for your question. Thank you for a fantastic session, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.